What's up, everybody? My name is Void Clown. It's not actually my real name, but it's the coolest thing I could come up with in like 5 minutes when creating my channel. And today we're going to talk about one of Lovecraft's most underrated stories, I think, which is Rats in the Walls. And Rats in the Walls by H.P. Lovecraft, Howard Phillips Lovecraft. I think there's two reasons why it's that underrated, and that is that on one side it's just terribly racist. There's just N-bombs all the way. And the second reason is that it is not that much of this eldritch cosmic horror, or it's more hidden. It's more of a classic horror story, which we more associate with Edgar Allan Poe, for example. It was one of the earliest stories that Lovecraft wrote that really guided him into what he was going to do. So I found something about this story which I haven't found a lot of discussion about online, at least. And that is that the main part of the story, at least to me, or one of the main parts of the stories, is very similar to a dream that Carl Gustav Jung, the famous psychologist and philosopher, he had a dream which was basically exactly the same. There's like so many cool similarities in between of those two, and I don't think that it's a coincidence, and that there's something here that I would at least want to discuss with everybody. So to get in there, we're gonna have a short summary of the story, and then we're gonna talk about who Lovecraft is, then we're gonna talk about the dream, then we're gonna talk about who Carl Gustav Jung is, because most people aren't that deep into both of those guys. Pun absolutely intended, I guess. And also what's really cool is that this dream was at the same time that the story was written. It was in the beginning of the 1920s. First, I'm gonna give you a brief summary of what the story is actually about. So, Rats in the Walls. Rats in the Walls was written by H.P. Lovecraft in 1923, and it was first published in Weird Tales in March 1924. It was an upcoming thing back then that there were a lot of magazines that published this literature. It's like pulp magazine. It's kind of shunned, especially by the educated elites, and it's all this ghost stuff and all this weird stuff and aliens and scary stuff, and you can't take it seriously, right? Well, Lovecraft proved us otherwise. That's why there's this Lovecraftian horror, cosmic horror, the Lovecraftian circle. It's basically the second genre of horror. It's basically the new horror after Edgar Allan Poe, which was classic horror, and then Lovecraft and his colleagues and friends made cosmic horror. And these magazines was like a cheap thing, I guess. They published these stories, just like you would buy a Mickey Mouse magazine or something. Nobody would take it seriously until a certain point. Okay, so to get the story, it's only a couple of pages. It's like minus 28 pages. If you have it as a PDF, it's like 15 pages or so. First disclaimer, there's a horrible name for the cat. Lovecraft named the cat after his own cat, which he got at like 8 years old or so, with already that name. And I guess that's why he named the cat in this story the same word, which I'm not gonna repeat, and I'm just gonna call the cat Howard, because it's Howard Phillips Lovecraft, and it's Howard Philip Lovecraft. It's like a Uno reverse card on him. And also the second part is, which is a bit more meaningful, is that Lovecraft's best friend, or one of his best friends, was Robert E. Howard. And they had a really deep connection, like a literary connection almost, like both of them wrote, and it was a literary connection. Both of them wrote, they helped each other out and talked about stories. And so that's why I call the cat Howard. So to start with the story is about the protagonist. We only know his last name. It's Delapour, or Delapoer. He changes it in the middle of the story. And the story, I'm going to tell it a little bit more chronological than it is written. So he lives in America, and when he was a child, he saw his grandfather's house burn down and the grandfather inside. He knows that there's this family secrecy which has always been passed on in form of an envelope, and it was only given to the next person in line posthumously. So the grandfather would write everything down into a letter, or maybe it was the same letter, and then after he died, the letter would be given to the next oldest one, and they would read it, but would only give it to the next one after they die. It is a very honorable family, and people look up to it. I think he has a factory or something. And what happens is that his son, who's going to war in England, he has a friend called Captain Norris, and the son actually is the one who brings the whole story back to him. When he's like, hey, there's this house, there's this estate in England called Exham Priory. This is where our ancestors were from, because they're called Delapour and we are called Delapoer. No, the other way around. Whatever. There's actually this house which was given to the crown because everybody died. He decides to buy the house. The house is like, it's described as a shell-like ruin. It's an old, very old house. Basically, only the walls are standing. Nothing's left. And what he really quickly finds out is that everybody hates him. Everybody hates the house. Everybody hates the whole family. And in the beginning, he doesn't really know why. But then he finds out that there are so many horrible tales and cruel associations with his family. So he finds out that basically the family plagued the whole countryside for centuries, maybe even longer. And they would kidnap people, they would have horrible orgies, they would commit horrible crimes, sacrifices, human sacrifices, animal sacrifices. They had a lot of animals that they were breeding and vegetables, so they were kind of having farms, I guess. And everybody hates them. And so he says, okay, I want to go there and I want to show these people that the Delapoer can actually be a nice person, because he's a nice person. And so, yeah. What he also finds out, so he finds all these old songs and all these old epics and stories. One of them is the story which is that when the next successor in line wasn't as much in line with the family values, which, you know, this cruel and dark and occult stuff, he would be taken care of, and then, you know, the succession would go to actually somebody whose character was more into doing things that shouldn't be done. Another story, which is more than just a myth, is that one of his ancestors actually was like, nope, this is it, I'm gonna kill everybody in my family. And also, this isn't the channel where I'm gonna say unalive and all those things, because I think that's just not it. And so this ancestor, he murdered everybody in the family except for himself, and then he fled to America, where he founded a family, and he's basically the direct line of his. And then afterwards, what happened to the estate is that for a while nothing happened, and then an explosion of rats just scourged all over the countryside, and they ate all the cattle, dogs, pigs, and then like even 2 people. So this is like the first time we hear about the rats. So he restores this whole house, and he also has help of several people which he calls savants, so people who are very prolific and very talented in one special field, which is in that case architecture and history. And so these people restore the house in a way that it looks, at least from the outside, very much like it looked back then. And the inside is actually very modern, he says. Then, unfortunately, his son returns from the war as an invalid, and later on even dies, and so he's very grief-stricken. And what he does is that on 16th July 1923, I moved into Exham Priory after the last workman had finished his labors. So he's sad, he moves there, he sees this like his last task of life, to show these people that this was actually a nice family, you know, or at least somebody in this family can be nice. Apparently, the whole family ends with him, as his only son died. And as he lives there, you know, we learn a lot more about the house. So for example, one thing that is going to be very important to this video, the house is descending, in the architecture it's descending historically. So it starts with Gothic structure, and then Saxon and Old England, and then the cellar is Roman and like even pre-Roman architecture. So as you go down, things get older. And this makes this house very unique, and it's been studied a lot by historians and architects while it was left alone. And also what he brings with him to the house is several servants and a couple of cats, and his favorite cat, which is called Howard. There's only one mention of, or 2 mentions of a woman in the whole story. It's very, very centered around men. One of them is a cook, which is gonna have like one happening, and the other 1 or 2 are people from his heritage who committed horrible crimes. And that's it. We don't hear anything about, you know, if he ever had a wife or anything. So he moves in, and very soon some weird stuff happens, which is that he has weird dreams, and he swears he can hear and almost see swarms of rats behind the tapestry in the walls. So he has a horrible dream that reoccurs, which is that there's a swineherd in a grotto, old Twilight grotto, a cave, a huge cave, and he looks down on this grotto and he sees a swineherd who looks very demonic, and the swineherd has these beasts with him that are like fungal, and the swineherd falls asleep, and as soon as he falls asleep, there's a swarm of rats just descending upon them. It's like a flood, and they eat everything. And then he wakes up. When he wakes up, he sees and hears rats behind the walls. So the tapestry is moving, and he hears the screams and twitching of rats. And also the cat. So Howard, the cat, reacts to this. The cat is, scratching at the walls and, tries to get into the small gaps, put his paw inside, and tries to get some of these rats. But that's it. Nobody else except for the rats and him ever get to witness this. So the one woman I talked about, she's a chef, and what she does is she tells him that during the night the cat's just going ham on invisible rats that she couldn't see. Everybody's a bit irritated, but especially him, because he sees and witnesses and experiences this horror, and otherwise it's only the cats, which isn't really calming. And so he comments that usually in ghost stories, there's the dogs who react to the ghost, and then later on the humans witness the ghost. He explains it as, well, I guess the cats are doing that as well. That's basically it. And so his next idea is, okay, I'm just gonna buy a lot of rat traps and put them around the rooms, like a circle around the bed, and then if there's rats, they're gonna catch him, right? Well, guess what? He has a nightmare, he wakes up, there's rats everywhere, he turns on the light, rats are gone, all the traps are sprung, nothing in them. Horrifying. And so this is what's happening for a while. He lives in these circumstances. Then one night, same thing happens again, and he wakes up, he turns on the light, but the rats don't disappear. He swears he can hear them, he swears he can see them behind the tapestry. They descend down the building, and he just follows them with the cat Howard. He goes down, and then there's a cellar and a sub-cellar, this Roman sub-cellar that I talked about. And there is even like an old stone slab that looks like an altar with brown stains on them, I guess. We don't know what that could be. And then it goes even further down, and he's like, okay, guess I gotta find out what's going on there. So he has Captain Norris come over, and they stay the night down there. They close the door, they have Howard, the cat, with them. Okay, let's see what happens. It's gonna happen again. Interestingly, Captain Norris and some other specialists that come, they do not take him for a fool. They actually take this very seriously. They realize that, okay, if this guy is reacting to this, and there was this old tale with the rats, there's gotta be something, right? So everybody is actually not doubting him and is like, okay, let's find out what's going on. So he stays down there in the night. Like, they let the servants carry down some couches. It's really cute. And they stay there with Howard the cat. And he always dozes off into his nightmares until he's being awoken by Norris, who's like, hey, here we go again. Rat tornado. And rats come and rats go. And they go down. And they're like, okay, so it clearly goes through the basement. And then they look around the basement, and they have their lanterns, and they put the lantern, one of them, next to the altar. They realize that there's a draft of air going down. They go to town. They hire a couple of specialists, like a psychic and an anthropologist and people like that. And are like, okay, let's get to the bottom of this. And they do that. They rip open in very archaeological responsibility. They rip open the altar, and immediately they find stone stairs that go down. And one of I think an archaeologist of the group is like, yep, I can tell you that these stairs were not made into the rock from up down, but actually from down up. And they see 2 human skulls, or semi-human, which is going to be one of the things in the story. So they're not sure if it's actually a human skull. And then they descend down the stairs, and as they go down, the cat is also coming with them, of course. They see this huge grotto, which is very similar to the one that he dreamed of. It's a huge cave, and in the cave there's a lot of buildings, and the whole floor is just full of bones. There's rat bones, of course. And then there's also very many human bones and semi-human bones. So they look, for example, like the bones of a gorilla, or they look like some humanoid that was on all fours. And there's buildings which are, it's different buildings from different times. There's, for example, an English butchery, which Captain Norris goes inside, but it's just too spooky in there for him, so he runs out again. And there's a lot of creepy things like containers filled with human remains, and there's prison cells with people who were clearly kept as meat. And they're all humans or semi-humans. And many of the bones, or all of the bones, have these gnaw marks of rats, but also of somebody else, which would have been human. So yeah, everything is very unpleasant. They find a lot there, and I'm gonna get into this later on in the analysis, but basically, yeah, they find a lot of creepy stuff, and at one point, De La Puer, he stumbles, and he gets lost in the sauce. He goes a bit crazy, and he sees nothing anymore, and he kind of gets possessed by this spirit, this family curse, this thing that the rats represent, and he just runs, and apparently he runs into Captain Norris, and later on the group finds him on a half-eaten Captain Norris, and he's being put into a mental hospital. And what he's trying to make everybody believe is that, oh, it wasn't him, it was the rats. Can't they see that it was the rats who did this? It wasn't him, it was the rats, clearly. And on that note, it ends. Which brings us to the next portion of the video. So, let's talk about Lovecraft. Just the basic biography. Lovecraft was born in Rhode Island in 1890. He was born in Rhode Island in 1890, and he only lived till 1937. He was an only child. One thing is that his father was put into a mental hospital only 3 years after he was born, and then died when Lovecraft was 8 years old. And Lovecraft took that very badly, of course. So he had a very weird relationship with his mom. He lived with his mom until his mom died in 1921. He had a big relationship with his grandparents. And then when his grandfather died, who did a lot of the financial support, there was even a bigger financial strain on the family. And what Lovecraft did in his life was that he was a writer. He started doing poetry when he was 6 years old, and even as a child he was interested in science, like for example archaeology. And he became a pioneer of the genre that we now know as cosmic horror or Lovecraftian horror. I think we can use them as synonyms. There's way less writing of his concerning story than there is writing of his in letters to other people who wrote stories. So his impact wasn't just the own stories he wrote, but it was, in fact, the many other authors of that time who were friends of his and who he co-wrote stories with. So he would also ghostwrite stories, and he would let other people have the credit for his story, but in fact he wrote more than half of the story. My cat is doing things. Say hello. This is Igor. He's a Maine Coon. And he's super cute, and also I'm not going to record anymore when we're getting close to his mealtime. So cosmic horror, putting it together, is basically the classic horror, which is the Edgar Allan Poe horror, is always associated with earthly horrors, witches, curses, ghosts, vampires, zombies, werewolves. And all of these horrors, you usually have a way to deal with them and to understand them. There's a lore behind them. They're connected to the human culture and to Earth. If you have your crucifix and your holy water, and if you do the right spell, then you can fight them off and you can win. And then actually coming out of that, you might even learn something and become a stronger person. There's a hero in these stories, and the hero can win. And Lovecraftian horror is everything that you don't understand, that's bigger than you and bigger than our dimension. There's a god, for example, that dreams our whole universe. When he wakes up, then it's just over. The color out of space. There is a meteor striking farmland in America, and in that meteor there is a color that people have never seen. And the family where the meteor struck right in front of their farmhouse, they actually suffer from something that is like radiation poisoning, which was written way before nuclear bombs and everything. And so in Lovecraftian horror, there is always this element of madness, of not understanding what's going on, and of things that you can only partly understand. It's way more about surviving what is going on than becoming a hero or defeating the monster. And Rats in the Walls is kind of between the both of them because it is mostly about a family curse and like these phantom rats. But there is the mentioning of Nyarlathotep, which is one of the Lovecraftian gods that is an eldritch being. And there is the element of him going mad. Yeah. But what I want to talk about today is a very, very important motif in the Rats in the Walls. And the reason I want to talk about it is because I'm a very big fan of Jung, and Jung once had a dream. And I'm going to read the dream to you because it's not that long. So he had that dream around the time Lovecraft wrote the story. I was in a house I did not know, which had 2 stories. It was my house. I found myself in the upper story, where there was a kind of salon furnished with fine old pieces in Rococo style. On the walls hung a number of precious old paintings. I wondered that this should be my house and thought, not bad. But then it occurred to me that I did not know what the lower floor looked like. Descending the stairs, I reached the ground floor. There everything was much older. I realized that this part of the house must date from about the 15th or 16th century. The furnishings were medieval. The floors were of red brick. Everywhere it was rather dark. I went from one room to another, thinking, now I must really explore the whole house. I came upon a heavy door and opened it. Beyond it, I discovered a stone stairway that led down into a cellar. Descending again, I found myself in a beautifully vaulted room, which looked exceedingly ancient. Examining the walls, I discovered layers of brick among the ordinary stone blocks, and chips of brick in the mortar. As soon as I saw this, I knew that the walls dated from Roman times. My interest by now was intense. I looked more closely to the floor. It was of stone slabs, and in one of these I discovered a ring. When I pulled it, the stone slab lifted, and again I saw a stairway of narrow stone steps leading down to the depths. These, too, I descended and entered a low cave cut into rock. Thick dust lay on the floor, and in the dust were scattered bones and broken pottery, like remains of a primitive culture. I discovered 2 human skulls, obviously very old and half disintegrated. Then I awoke. Okay, now so a couple of words about C.G. Jung, or Carl Gustav Jung, who was born in 1875 and died in 1961. He was a Swiss psychiatrist. He was a lot in contact, and there was a lot of dialogue in the teachings and ideas of Freud and Jung. So, for example, a big idea of his was the collective unconscious, which was that all humans and the whole human race have like a collective unconscious mind that stirs and impacts the way our society behaves. It's also one of the reasons why there's so many reoccurrences. But another reason of that is, of course, the archetypes. Archetypes are types and ideas and expressions that reoccur in all cultures. So, for example, the idea of the hero, the idea of a warrior, the idea of a god, the idea of the dark monster, the idea of, the classics like the wise old man or the motherly woman, stuff like that. But this is already one thing where the both of them come really close, which is that both Lovecraft and Jung have a big emphasis on archaeology. Jung actually wanted to become an archaeologist, but he was too poor, and so he had to become the godfather of his own psychological school, I guess. He traveled a lot across the world, and he found all these old and ancient paintings and murals and figurines, and he saw that they were connected. And the thing with an archetype is you can never find the true archetype. But what you can do is you can kind of triangulate these archetypes. So every cultural expression of an archetype kind of paints around the core, and so you get closer and closer the more you interplay with society and culture and the world, and you get to spiral towards certain archetypes, but you never get to find them. He had some archetypes, of course, that he talked about, but basically it's also an idea. It's not like there are just 5 and those 5 are the archetypes. But it's also interesting that they're not just archetypes of, beings, but also of stories. For example, the flood myth is a worldwide concept that you find in many religious texts, like Noah, for example. that is one expression of this flood archetype, that the flood that comes and takes everything away. And then there's two more things which I really like about Jung, two more ideas. One of that is the individuation, which is that you basically have this true self that you can become, and you can only become it if you confront yourself, the conscious and the unconscious parts. And individuation is like the journey of becoming a real human being. And then the other one is the shadow, which is the idea that not only do you have certain parts like the id and the ego and the superego, but you also have the shadow. And what the shadow is that you have this dark part of you that you don't like and that people usually neglect. It's all the aggression, it's everything that you don't want to accept about yourself, all the dark things. And when you suppress it too much, then it erupts and you unconsciously enact this shadow. All of these things I just talked about. It's a very rough outline. This is a hole that goes deep, man. You're welcome to just learn about it, watch some books, read some movies. But it's really important work for also analyzing art. And so some more similarities and connections between Lovecraft and Jung that I really like. So when Lovecraft wrote the Dunwich Horror, he put a quote in the beginning by Charles Lamb from Witches and Other Night Fears. I'm going to read it to you, it's not that long. Gorgons and hydras and chimeras, dire stories of Sileno and the harpies, may reproduce themselves in the brain of superstition. But they were there before. They are transcripts, types. The archetypes are in us, and eternal. How else should the recital of that which we know in a waking sense to be false come to affect us all? How else should the recital of that which we know in a waking sense to be false come to affect us at all? Is it that we naturally conceive terror from such objects, considering in their capacity of being able to inflict upon us bodily injury? Oh, least of all, these terrors are of older standing. They date beyond body, or without the body they would have been the same. That the kind of fear here treated is purely spiritual. That it is strong in proportion as it is objectless on earth. That it predominates in the period of our sinless infancy. Our difficulties, the solution of which might afford some probable insight into our ante-mundane condition, and a peep at least into the shadowland of pre-existence. Wow. Cat is here again. Okay, so there's one big thing about Jung and Lovecraft, which is a big difference, and that is that for Jung, Jung believed in God. He didn't just believe in God, he said, oh, I know that God exists.
Everybody went to church on Sunday.
And did you believe in God?
Oh, yes.
Do you now believe in God?
Now? Difficult to answer. I know. I don't need to believe.
Life had meaning, life has meaning, and the individuation process is to give your life meaning. And with Lovecraft, it was the absolute opposite. Lovecraft was an atheist, he was very scientific, and with Lovecraft you have the idea that there is no meaning. Life is meaningless. The only thing you can do is basically avoid the horrors. That are really different. With Lovecraft you have all these, in almost every Lovecraft story and game and book and movie, and all the new ones, there is very often a cult. There is a cult of humans that cater to a god, and this god actually exists in the stories. It's always that the god then later comes back and destroys everything, or that it could come back and destroy everything, and that the god has immense power over these people, and the people dedicate their whole lives to this. And so for example, in the Rats in the Walls, you have the Delaporte family who have this cult that is for Nyarlathotep in the end. And then in Shadow over Innsmouth, you have all these fish people who pray to Dagon, which is like kind of just a really big fish man, but also just Dagon and Hydra are like two fish deities, but they're actually physical entities. And when you go away and look at newer Lovecraftian movies, for like my favorites, for example, are The Ritual or Apostle. There are always these cults that pray to something that is actually there, and that is having all the power over these people and the land. And these people always seem to do this in a kind of, that's just the way it is. It's never a conscious decision. They're not like, I've taken all the points and I've seen all the writings and I think I'm going to decide to heed to this god. No, they just go there and it kind of grips them. The power of these gods starts with them praying to the god without even having a decision or a say in it. And that is kind of the unconscious part of Jung, right? This is when you have these things in your life, for example, with the shadow, that as long as you don't see what's going on, it will have a tremendous power over you. And there's also this idea that is very Jungian, which is that you have to be conscious of which type or archetype or myth you're acting out. Because if you're not, then it might be a very bad one, right? Everybody knows these people that, for example, are very alone, and you think to yourself, well, it would be really easy for them to, have friends and, have a good life, but they're spiraling in on themselves into this idea of being this alone, sad being. And you can do this with drugs or being a CEO. You can do this with business success, people who always have to dominate others. There's always this, like, which archetype are you manifesting in yourself? And if you don't know what it is, then it's not gonna be healthy. So one archetype or myth, or archetypal myth structure that is in Rats and the Walls would be, for example, the basement, right? You have the basement and everything in the story leads towards the basement. He's drawn towards the basement. The rats go down the basement. If you follow the architecture, you end up in the basement and then you know what is below. And that's, why is that so? With archetypes you often have this thing, like when you watch a Disney movie or so, you don't think like, oh, why is Pinocchio's dad just eaten by the whale and why then Pinocchio goes there and he rescues them? You just accept it, it absolutely makes sense. Because it makes sense in a way that is bigger than life, right? Why is this? What's up with the basement, man? Like for example in the game Darkest Dungeon, why is the Darkest Dungeon down there? Why is in Harry Potter? Why is the Philosopher's Stone in the dungeons of Hogwarts? Why is in Bloodborne? Why are the Pthumerian labyrinths, which are below the whole city? Why is that there? It's always where things started, kind of. It's always where there is endless potential there, and also great dangers. It's like in the book by Jules Verne, I think it's Jules Verne, Journey to the Center of the Earth. The people have this race who gets to the center of the earth fastest, or it's more of a fight than a race. And down there, you find the philosophical ecstasy, you find the meaning, you find the truth. You find truth. I think that's the best word to say. You find truth. If you look right and you avoid all the terrors, you get to find truth. You get to find a treasure that is more than just gold. So in Rats and the Walls, Telepoer finds a truth that is very unpleasant, and he can't brave it. It's too strong. He basically gives in to these urges and to this curse. And although he never learned anything about this, in his upbringing, he basically only read some books and heard some stories about it. He immediately takes on this role of this predator who eats people. And then when you take a Jungian approach to this story, so in the Jungian and the Lovecraftian dream, they're very much the same. So what it does is you have this architecture that goes back in time, right? The deeper you go, the further you go back in time, further in generations. You come to the Middle Ages, you come to Stonehenge, and you come to cavemen. Same thing in both stories. And then there's these two human or almost human skulls at the stairs in the basement in both stories, which I love. And you can say, for example, okay, this is your mom and your dad, or your mom and your mom, and your dad, or whatever. It's your parents. So you can also say that it's Adam and Eve. So it's either where you in your family come from, or it's where we as humans come from. So you can take an evolutionary approach to it. And then everything that's below is pre-human. It's why we can understand animal behavior on more than just the basic facts, because we feel the story that the animal is going through. It's probably more than just projection of our lives when we see animals do a behavior. For example, that a crow trades something with you, or a whale protects a diver from sharks. There's things that are trans-species. And I think that with Jung, especially, it was more that he originated from these people on a personal sense, and with Lovecraft, the same. These skulls are the ancestors of the protagonist. And then we come to the biographical part, which I really like, and that is that in Rats on the Walls, there's this descent into insanity. And you can tell that Lovecraft probably his whole life was very afraid that he would also go insane, that he would also, the same thing that happened to his dad would happen to him. And so, of course, you are afraid that one day you hear the rats in the walls, right? One day, the thing that, maybe you have an alcoholic father, for example, and one day you start drinking. Or maybe you skipped it, and then one day, you have a son or a daughter, and they turn 17, 18, and you think, oh, they're also dodging this bullet, right? We're good, we did it. And then they have their first big crisis, and then you see them pick up a bottle and never stop. And you realize that there's this curse on your family that just happens. And then we have the aspect of generational trauma. So a friend of mine who's called Jakub, and he's also really into Jung, and we had like a 2-hour talk about this story. He never knew about the story, and I just paraphrased it for him. And he helped me a bit with the Jungian analysis of it. And he came up with this idea of generational trauma. I asked him, like, hey, without me giving you any idea of what I think is happening here, what is your idea that the rats are doing? What are the rats in the walls? Because everything else in the story you kind of know, but why are the rats there? They don't exist, right? There was only once this wave of rats. And what he said was, I think it's generational trauma. And it really makes sense, it's this filth. What are rats in this sense especially? Rats are amazing creatures, of course, but in this sense, in this story, rats are filth and they're a threat. They're disgusting. Of course, they could be the generational trauma or the generational curse that goes from the most modern generation down to the oldest in the family, like before we were even human. And I guess what I have to say is generational trauma is that the trauma of one generation. So, for example, a famine, World War II, Holocaust, horrible things that happen. It's not just the people that suffered through this who have to live with it. It's not just the Holocaust survivor and then his kids are fine. It's that the pain and the suffering and the trauma of this experience is being handed over and over and over with every generation. And it's really hard to escape that. There's actually studies, for example, that it changes your DNA so that people in an area where there's famine, the same families later on, centuries later on, they have genes that make them more susceptible to gain fat. Which would have been a good thing back then, right? That's probably the reason, or an adaptation how they survived the famine. But now it makes them way more susceptible to heart attack. These people have a manifold factor in having a heart attack, for example, or suffering from heart disease or clotted veins. So you see that, there's this one impact, this one hammer that once hit the family, and it just left the chip in the DNA or in the code or in the collective unconscious of the family, the psyche of the family, that never healed or didn't heal for many generations. And then there's always this thing when people say, oh, my parents, they were super focused on their job and it was really bad and I suffered a lot from it, so I will not do that. I will be completely different than them, and I will always see that my job is only the money and I have time for everything else. But what they then don't realize is that their compass is still on the same north as their parents. They still set their life and orient their life around the same things. They just move around them differently. I have friends whose parents were alcoholics when they were a child, and they were horrified by it, and they are now 35, 40, whatever, and they have never had a drink in their life. Which could be a good thing, right? But it's still that, it still has a huge impact on you, the whole thing. You just, the compass is still north. You still have the same coordinates on this map. You just walk a bit of a different path, but you're still not free of this curse, of this trauma. But then there's this one big question of Rats in the Walls, which is, what are the rats, right? They're not real. Why are the rats doing this? And I think personally it's that they announce themselves, or that they announce to the protagonist to follow them, and they're like a signal to be like, hey, there's this thing. You can't ignore it. You can't ignore it. Don't ignore it. Don't ignore it. There's this thing happening here. Because if they weren't there, then he would never have found out what was actually going on there. He would never have found out what was actually inside of him, or who he actually was, right? It's this thing that you often do in therapy where you approach your whole family and what happened before. And the only reason you do this is because there was so much pain in your life. For example, you realized, every weekend I'm blackout drunk. And that, for example, could be the rats in the walls, right? It's this thing that's hitting you in the face, like, here, look, there's pain. Here, look, there's something wrong. Please look at this. And you ignore it. It's unconscious. And then one day you look at it. One day you confront this part of yourself. And that is what I think is, at least for me, the way I read this story. It is that this protagonist had to confront his past and the demons of his family. And the only way he could do that was because when he was there, the way was led by the rats. So with this analysis and the whole video being as long as it is, which is that I want to hear from you what you think this story is about. And I thank you so much for watching this video. Also, I found a Jungian analysis of Rats in the Walls. It's in a book that's more than 50 years old, and when you buy it online, including the shipping, it's $100. So, yeah, we'll never know, I guess. I think there was like 2,000 copies of it when it was made, and yeah, if somebody has it, that would be cool to know what a professional Jungian analysis of Rats in the Walls is, but I guess this is as close as it gets. I couldn't find anything about this on YouTube. That's why I made this video. So yes, thank you all for watching. And I'm really looking forward here to creating a channel that is about stories, books, movies, computer games, and how I view them and my analysis. And I've just watched so many video essays, and I always wanted to do this. And yeah, so here it goes. Please give me your feedback. I really want to hear what you think what this story is, because it's just a couple of pages, so it's easy to read, and there's a bunch of audio versions of it online that are for free. And yes, I wish you a wonderful Christmas and a Happy New Year. Thank you all for tuning in.